Welcome to the historic city of Chester. The city's rich history, architectural heritage and economy have all had a bearing on modern fire safety considerations from both a fire prevention and a firefighting perspective. The name for Chester comes from the Latin word for camp, castra. From the time the Romans first set up camp in around 70 AD, the heart of the city has continued to evolve. The buildings were constructed from locally quarried sandstone, as you can see from the city's walls and other Roman remains, and the Romans abandoned the city in the 4th century. Next to arrive were the Saxons, who occupied the area between 800 and 1066. The Normans, who occupied the town until the end of the 13th century, built wooden houses on top of the crumbling Roman ruins. Unable to dig into the bedrock to create cellars for the storage of their goods, the 14th century merchants built houses and shops on top of the Roman rubble, but kept the plan of the Roman streets. This resulted in a low-level shop frontage and a raised rear level, apparent in the rows as we know them today. As the medieval buildings, made predominantly from timber, decayed, some were replaced, but in many cases they were covered with a brick fascia, and much of what we see in Chester today dates back only to the 18th century. In the Victorian period, the fashion at the time was to move away from Georgian red brick and replace it with Tudor-style black beams and white plaster. The changing fortunes of the building's owners meant that by the 1960s, the rows were in a very poor state of repair. Whilst many buildings on the rows were restored during the Chester Conservation Programme of the 1970s, the legislation of the day prohibited the use of many of the upper floors, exacerbating the decline of the unoccupied parts. However, by the 1980s, the rows had become desirable again, even though the upper floors were still out of use. As development continues throughout the city, much of its past is still being uncovered. Archaeological digs precede much of Chester's development, and as a result, more of its history comes to light. Today, development is carefully controlled so that it causes as little damage as possible to the architectural heritage, hence the need for sympathetic solutions. Chester is both historically and economically significant. Over time, its strategic location has seen the city thrive as a port, trading centre and a staging post for merchants and travellers alike. Today, businesses and tourists continue to flock to the city. Visit Chester and Cheshire estimates the visitor economy to be worth in the region of £810 million, and the number of visitors to Chester and its local area each year in the region of 18.2 million people. This supports around 12,000 jobs. So what impresses visitors most about Chester? A recent survey revealed that it's the city walls, the architecture and buildings, and the character of the historic town. Whilst the close proximity of the shops, restaurants, historic buildings and other attractions adds to its popularity, the relatively compact size creates its own issues from a fire safety perspective. The Great Fire of London in 1666 helped standardise urban firefighting. The fire devastated 1/3 of the city, and some form of compensation was called for in the public outcry which followed. Dr. Nicholas Barban introduced the first company offering insurance protection against fire with its own fire brigade. Others followed his lead, and properties were protected in this way until the early 1800s. Policyholders were given a badge or fire mark to affix to their building. If a fire started, the fire brigade was called. If the building had a fire mark, provided it was the right one, the fire would be dealt with. Over time, these smaller individual companies merged, including those in London, who merged in 1833 to form the London Fire Engine Establishment. Chester's rows present operational firefighting crews with a particular challenge, i.e. access to all areas. The Fire and Rescue Services Act of 2004 states that a fire and rescue authority must make provision for the purpose of extinguishing fires and protecting life and property in the event of fires in its area. In making this provision, a fire and rescue service must make arrangements for obtaining information needed for such purposes. This is referred to as the 7-2D process. Part of the 7-2D process is that crews are able to familiarise themselves with individual buildings and their layout, establish how buildings interconnect, know where the natural fire breaks are to be found, can identify examples of compartmentation, and know which areas are sprinklered. To supplement water supplies, the Chester City Centre plan is in place. The plan focuses on a water relay system which can be set up depending on the location of the fire. There are various access points around the city walls. Water can be drawn either from the canal on the northern and eastern side of the city, or the River Dee to the south and west.